Hi, it's Amy from Cakes with Faces. I've just got back from Japan from a trip to Kyushu and Tokyo, where I recorded every single thing I spent to give you an idea of how expensive things are in Japan and how much money you might need for your trip. I've made spreadsheets, I've got graphs, I've got all the information based on my real life experiences as a tourist in Japan this year in 2024. I'm going to cover food, transport, and admission fees and totals for what I spent on cheaper days and more expensive days. We're focusing on what you spend while you're there, but at the end of the video, I'll mention how much I spent on hotels and flights because people always ask. I used an app called TravelSpend to keep note of everything. It converts the amounts to your home currency so you can understand straight away how much everything was. It records the locations and you can categorize them. You can get it on Android and iPhone. There's a free version, or if you upgrade to the paid version, you can upload a photo of your receipt. But I think for most people, the free version would do the job. I've not included spending money for shopping or games arcades because those amounts can vary a lot depending how much you choose to spend. I'll say the amounts in yen and I'll put the amounts in British pounds and US dollars on the screen. At the moment, the exchange rate is really good, which makes everything that little bit cheaper. So just be aware that in the future that may change. This isn't about how to have a budget trip or save money. If you watch my videos, you'll know my style. I'm not particularly trying to save money. I want to enjoy my time in Japan and do what I want to do, but I also don't really have very expensive taste. We're not that extravagant. And particularly on this trip, we didn't really eat at very expensive places. For example, we're more than happy with conveyor belt sushi, coco curry, and just normal places that aren't that expensive. And my Japan guidebook has pages to help you budget your trip based on the number of days and what you plan to do. It also has help with booking everything right from the start. You can get it from cakeswithfaces.co.uk with worldwide shipping. Please buy as much as you can from my shop, especially when you hear how much the flights were. First, let's talk about food. We ate out every day. There was no self-catering. So the total for the 13-day trip, including drinks and snacks, was 59,500 yen per person, which comes out as an average of 4,577 yen per person per day. I think prices for food in Japan are very reasonable and the quality is excellent, even at cheap places. This time, I don't think we really had very expensive meals. So here's some examples to give you an idea of what we had. For breakfast, we'd most often go to a bakery. Japanese bakeries are amazing. There are so many delicious options. Or we'd go to a convenience store where you can get onigiri rice balls or bakery items, which are good, but not as good as the proper bakery. And I really like these yogurt smoothie drinks. That would cost around 600 to 1,000 yen for 2 people. Some days we didn't have breakfast and went straight into an early lunch. Coco curry opens at 11 a.m. or maybe we'd have some ramen. On to lunch. We used to have convenience store items for lunch, and that is a really good budget option, but we both really like Japanese food, so now we try and make the most of the limited number of meals you have during your trip. So mostly this time we went for a lightish meal for lunch. Here's some examples. A gyoza restaurant was 3,350 yen for 2 people for several plates of gyoza with side orders of edamame and tofu. A fast food lunch at Moss Burger was 1,830 yen for 2 people for burgers, fries and drinks. Ramen at Ippudo, a ramen chain, was 3,730 yen for a bowl of ramen each, a drink, and we shared a plate of 10 gyoza. There are many cheaper ramen places, but we are a bit limited because of me being vegetarian. Lunch at a local restaurant in Nagasaki Prefecture was only 2,000 yen for a toast set with salad. This toast was delicious, a tsukimi udon noodle bowl, and I also had a melon soda float. On another day, we grabbed lunch at the station to take on the shinkansen. I had a veggie bento for 580 yen, and Phil had a very fancy katsu sandwich, a lot fancier than the ones from the convenience store, for 1,080 yen. We had lunch at Yayoi-ken, a chain restaurant that does teishoku set meals with all different little dishes, rice and miso soup, for 1,880 yen for 2 people. And our favourite, coco curry, is amazingly cheap. You get a satisfying meal to set you up for the day. 2,500 yen is about the average for 2 people, maybe up to 3,000 yen if we had extra sides like a naan bread and lots of toppings. It's always fantastic value and so good. On to dinner, and again, we don't really go anywhere that fancy. Here's some examples, and most of these include alcoholic drinks. Kanpai. First, conveyor belt sushi at Kura Sushi, which is a chain with branches everywhere. We always go several times because it's so good, and this time we spent between 2,780 yen and 4,170 yen for 2 people, depending how hungry we were. Bear in mind that I don't really eat that much, and for me, I always have the veggie rolls, which are the cheapest plates, although even the upgraded plates aren't that expensive. Most conveyor belt sushi places are pretty cheap. We did go to one that was a bit pricier. That was 6,510 yen for 2 people, and that was actually the most expensive meal of the trip. At a small okonomiyaki restaurant, we had an okonomiyaki each with a beer and a lemon sour for 3,500 yen. A tempura meal was 2,750 yen for 2 people with tempura, rice and miso soup plus drinks. One pricier meal we had was at a teppanyaki restaurant. That was 5,570 yen for 2 people. We had our own private booth with tatami mats. It was a great experience. We ordered a lot, an okonomiyaki each with extra toppings, and they were really big, plus drinks, edamame and gyoza. Because we went mainly to cheaper places this time, completely unintentionally, here's an example of a more expensive splash out meal from my last trip in 2023. It was in Kyoto at a small teppanyaki restaurant, which was 10,590 yen for 2 people. We had a fantastic meal, including wagyu beef and lots of different dishes, plus a sake flight for me and beers. It was totally worth it. There's a video about it on my channel. And finally, on to drinks and snacks. Vending machines are everywhere in Japan, so you'll mostly be buying drinks from them. They cost mostly between 140 to 180 yen each. Sometimes you can even see them for 100 yen. On to snacks. At this charming little cafe, for 2,050 yen, we had cake and the local speciality mochi. I loved this traditional matcha, and the place was gorgeous. A local umegai mochi filled with sweet red bean paste was 150 yen. Popcorn at Universal Studios Japan was 550 yen, and a Jaws hot dog was 850 yen. 2 cakes from Cozy Corner for 1,035 yen. Coolish ice creams from a vending machine were 180 yen each. Thick milkshakes from Shake Shack were 626 yen each. I had black sesame and it was delicious. Most of our drinks are from vending machines, but if you go into a cafe to rest your feet, you'll obviously be paying a bit more. For example, we went to the Yamaha cafe in Ginza, which is an upmarket area of Tokyo where all the designer shops are. For 1,400 yen, we had a fruit juice and I had the Sakura soda float. In the evening, we're usually exhausted, so instead of going out, we usually grab some drinks and snacks from the convenience store to take back to the hotel room. Our typical order would be beer and a chuhai, that's shochu and soda, so 2 alcoholic drinks plus 2 snacks and maybe a soft drink, and that usually comes to about 800 to 950 yen, depending what you get. Now, on to transport, which is another major category for your expenses when you're in Japan. I use a Suica card, an IC card, to pay for my trains. It's valid for the Tokyo Metro, local trains, trams, and buses in most places in Japan. I won't go into all the details about it here, but trains in Japan are run by lots of different companies, and Suica is valid for everything, so it's definitely the easiest option. If you want to know more, I do have a video about how to get around Tokyo. It's a few years old, but most of the information is still valid. Over the 13-day trip, I topped up my Suica card 8,000 yen. That's just for one person. I did spend 500 yen of that on a locker, which brings it down to 7,500 yen, which comes out to about 576 yen per day on average. There were some days where I didn't really use it that much, where I walked around, and other days where I seemed to burn through credit, and I definitely used my Suica card more when I was in Tokyo. I should also mention that having been to Tokyo many times, my plans might be a bit different to yours on the first trip to Tokyo. I wasn't trying to cover all the main areas in a few days, so if it's your first trip, you might be traveling more on the train train and your costs might be a bit higher. So for my time when I was in Tokyo, here's what I spent each day. The average was 906 yen per day for one person. The lowest was 450 yen. On that day, I stayed local to where I was staying and walked around, then took a couple of very short trips later in the day when my feet were hurting. The highest was 1,621 yen. On that day, I went all the way across the city to Ginza for lunch and then on to Odaiba. The Yurakamome line to Odaiba always seems slightly more pricey than the other lines. And on that day, I went the whole length of the line twice and back and forth quite a bit, and it did add up. Sometimes people ask me about day passes for trains in Tokyo because they're worried that when you use an IC card, there's no daily cap on fares, so there's no limit to what you could spend per day. But in my opinion, the trains in Tokyo aren't that expensive, especially compared to places like London. So I've never really found they've added up too much to worry about. If you'll be crisscrossing the city and going to lots of different places, taking lots of trains, a day pass probably will save you money. But you need to be aware that most of the passes aren't valid for all the trains. So there will be times when you'll have to take a roundabout route, which will take more time. The cheapest day pass is the Tokyo subway ticket, which is 1,500 yen for 72 hours. That's 3 days. On the face of it, that would save you money compared to what I spent. But it's only valid for Tokyo Metro lines. It doesn't include the JR lines in Tokyo. While the Tokyo Metro lines, as you can see, are very comprehensive, the JR lines are so useful, especially if you're staying near a JR line station. There's the JR Yamanote line, which goes around the city, and the Chuo Sobu line goes directly across the middle of the city. It's the most overlooked line, which is so useful. There is a pass that includes those JR lines and the Tokyo Metro. That one is 1,600 yen per day, which is more than I spent every day apart from that most expensive day. And what bumped the price up on that day was the Yurakamome line to Odaiba, which isn't included in that pass. You can get a day pass just for the Yurakamome line, which is 820 yen for the day, and that would have saved me money on that Odaiba day. But in real life, are you really going to spend time working all this out? You'd need to plan out what you're doing each day and which pass is the best for which day. If you are on a strict budget, a day pass will save you money, especially that Tokyo subway ticket, if you're okay with not taking the JR lines. But otherwise, I'd recommend IC cards because they're easier and they're valid for everything. You don't have to worry about it. In my experience, local trains in Japan aren't that expensive, so your costs aren't likely to spiral out of control. Next, on to long distance trains. I took a shinkansen trip from Osaka to Tokyo, which was 12,370 yen per person, and a single shinkansen trip between Fukuoka and Kokura was 3,780 yen for a short 16-minute journey. The Shinkansen isn't cheap, but it does get you there quickly, and it is an amazing experience. Part of my trip was in Kyushu, so I got a regional JR pass just for northern Kyushu. That covered bullet trains and trains run by Japan Railways in that area. It didn't cover local trains run by other companies or things like the Fukuoka subway or the trams in Kumamoto and Nagasaki or buses, so I did still use my Suga card during that time as well. That was 14,000 yen per person for a 5-day pass for northern Kyushu. The longest trip I took between Fukuoka and Nagasaki would have been 12,100 yen per person for the return trip, so that alone was almost as expensive as the pass. Without that long trip, individual tickets would have been cheaper. I also took a night ferry for 32,480 yen for 2 people. It is quite an unusual option. I've never taken one in Japan before. If I'd taken the Shinkansen for the same journey, it would have been 14,810 yen each. So the ferry cost less than paying for the train and a hotel for the night. Next, on to admission fees. We're talking about tickets for tourist attractions and things you have to pay to get into. The total spent on admission fees over the 13-day trip was 20,880 yen for 2 people. Compared to my previous trip in 2023, we actually spent a really similar amount. On that time, it was 24,840 yen for 2 people on a 2-week trip to Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka. I should say that total doesn't include 10,775 yen spent on karaoke for 2 people. That was over 3 visits with drinks. Karaoke isn't cheap, but it's so much fun. So here are some example prices for you. An aquarium was 2,090 yen per person. The ropeway in Nagasaki was 1,250 yen per person to see one of Japan's top night views. The Nagasaki Peace Museum was 200 yen per person. They keep the admission fees low so everyone can go. It was 700 yen for Kyushu National Museum. Team Lab Forest in Fukuoka was 2,200 yen, and Team Lab Borderless in Tokyo was more than that at 4,000 yen, but it is bigger. To get into Shinjuku Park was 500 yen. Most parks are free, but for this one and for Japanese gardens, you pay. We also went to Universal Studios, which I'll mention separately because theme parks are expensive. The tickets were 9,400 yen each, which I think isn't too bad compared with other major theme parks around the world. But we also got express passes because we only had one day there and the queues are so long, and they were expensive at 17,800 yen each, much more than the actual tickets themselves. You'll probably find a lot of the things you do, especially in Tokyo, don't really have admission fees, like when you're just walking around, exploring an area and seeing what it's like. For example, in Harajuku and Akihabara, the only cost is your spending money for shopping and games arcades, which is as much as you want it to be. Many temples and shrines are free, and for the ones that do have admission fees, they're usually only a few hundred yen. I'm always amazed how major shrines and temples, even in places like Kyoto, cost so little to visit. I know they're religious places, not tourist attractions, but that's not always the case with religious buildings in other countries. For example, Kiyomizu-dera in Kyoto is 400 yen per person. Kinkakuji, the Golden Temple, is 500 yen. Fushimi Inari Shrine is free, and so is Sensoji, the oldest temple in Tokyo, and also Meiji Jingu Shrine. And to give you an idea of other admission fees, here are some things we didn't do on this trip, but that you might do on your first trip to Japan. Shibuya Sky, the observation deck, is 2,200 yen. The Sky Tree is 1,800 or 2,700 yen, depending on if you go all the way to the top deck. The Mori Art Museum is 1,800 yen for their current exhibition. Tokyo National Museum is 1,000 yen, and the aquarium in Ikebukuro is 2,800 yen. Next, to give you an idea of how much money you might need, I've worked out the total I spent per day. Now, this doesn't include flights, accommodation, or the night ferry. The average spent per day for food, transport and admission fees was 6,580 yen per person. I've taken the cost of the Universal Studios tickets off that total because it throws the average off, but it does include the money I spent on karaoke. You will also need spending money for shopping and things like games arcades and gachapon. I compared that to my previous trip in 2023. The average on that trip was 6,538 yen per day, which is such a similar amount, although yours could be different if you have a different style of travelling. The most expensive day was Universal Studios Day because of those expensive express passes and the tickets, and food was a bit pricier there too. Theme parks are always expensive. The next most expensive was a day trip from Kumamoto to Shimabara, which is the city of swimming carp, and Mount Unzen. On that day, we spent 9,135 yen per person. It was a bit of an adventure going on a ferry and various modes of transport, and we also had our most expensive dinner that day. The cheapest day was our arrival day when we spent 2,876 yen per person. I think it was because we didn't really do much. We were exhausted, so we just strolled around, had a light lunch and dinner, and then went to sleep early. So that's how to save money in Japan. The next cheapest day was 3,870 yen per person. That was a day in Tokyo. We went to Shinjuku Park to see some early cherry blossoms, had ramen. Then in the afternoon, we didn't do any particular tourist attractions. We just walked around Ginza, spent several hours in a stationery shop, and then went to a diver and had conveyor belt sushi dinner. I feel like these totals might be a little bit misleading because if it's your first trip to Tokyo, you'll probably be doing different things and you might be going to more tourist attractions that cost a bit more. So as an example, I'm also going to include a day from my previous trip in 2023 when we did some more tourist attraction type things, and it was more like a first trip to Tokyo sort of day. On that day, we spent 13,545 yen per person. That included snacks around Tsukiji Market for breakfast/lunch, which did add up quite a bit. We had quite a few things each. Then we did 2 ticketed tourist attractions, Small Worlds Tokyo and Team Lab Planets. For dinner, we had shabu shabu hot pot, which turned out to be pricier than most dinners we've had in Japan, at 7,370 yen for 2 people. It's not expensive compared to the UK, but it is for Japan compared to what we'd usually pay. Next, onto hotels. Now, don't take too much notice of these prices because hotel prices change throughout the year. Location affects the price a lot. You pay different amounts on weekdays compared to weekends. Sometimes there are deals. I know other people have stayed in the same hotels I've stayed in and paid different amounts, and prices fluctuate so much, especially these days. But people always ask, so here's what I paid for my hotels. In Fukuoka, I paid £88.15 per night for a standard double room. It's not the cheapest hotel and nothing particularly fancy, close to the main Hakata station in Fukuoka. In Kumamoto, it was £108.65 per night for a Kumamon themed room. I can't wait to show you the room tour of this one. It's actually a really big room with 2 beds right by Kumamoto station, which isn't the city centre, but it's a convenient location, and Kumamon. In Tokyo, it was £161.62 per night for a double room at the Hotel Gracery, which is the Godzilla Hotel in Shinjuku in Kabukicho. I like this hotel. I've stayed there before. You can get cheaper hotels, you can get more expensive hotels, but it's in a perfect location. We had a fantastic view of Tokyo from the 18th floor, and most importantly, Godzilla on the roof. So the overall average is £119.47 for hotels at the end of February, start of March, which is the very end of the off-season at the start of spring. And finally, flights. Just like hotels, flight prices change so much throughout the year, and obviously it depends where you're flying from, whether you're flying direct or indirect, and which airline you choose. This time I flew with Japan Airlines direct from London to Japan. I flew economy on the way out and premium on the way back. I wanted to do premium both ways because it's such a long 14-hour flight these days, but premium economy is so expensive. I did film them both, and I'll be making a video comparing economy with premium so you can decide if it's worth it. So subscribe if you want to catch that. The price also includes 1 internal flight from Tokyo to Fukuoka, which we booked all together. So we landed in Fukuoka, then worked our way up through Japan and flew back from Tokyo. If you want to visit Kyushu or Hokkaido, that is a really good way to save yourself some travelling time. And if you book it all together with your international flights, it often doesn't cost that much more. So the total for all of that for 2 people was £2,657.22, which is so much more than it used to be. But everything's more expensive these days, especially flights, and they are having to go the long way around at the moment. So that is just how it is. And well done to you if you manage to get cheaper flights than that. There are cheaper airlines, and it does cost less if you fly indirect, or sometimes you can catch deals or sales. So I hope that gives you an idea of how expensive things are in Japan. Tokyo in particular has a reputation for being expensive, but really I think it's the flights and hotels that are the expensive part of your trip, and then once you're there, it's not too bad. Obviously, it also depends what prices you're used to in your country, but compared to the UK, Japan is a lot less expensive, especially for things like food, and also compared to California, where I went last year. So there's lots more help for planning your Japan trip on my channel, so have a look at my other videos, and I'll see you soon next week on Thursday. Bye bye.